In an emotional moment that shook the nation, Donald Trump Jr. led a heartfelt prayer honoring his close friend Charlie Kirk, who was tragically assassinated during a campus event in Utah. With millions watching, Trump Jr.'s words brought America to tears as he remembered Kirk's fight for conservative values and freedom. This powerful tribute is one of the most moving moments in recent U.S. history, leaving viewers across the nation grieving and united in sorrow. The campus of Utah Valley University had been buzzing with excitement on that fateful afternoon. Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist who had inspired millions of young Americans, was on stage answering tough questions with his usual calmness and conviction. Then, in one shattering instant, everything changed forever. A sudden crack split the air, echoing through the packed auditorium. Students screamed in terror as the horrifying reality dawned on them. Security personnel rushed forward toward the stage where Kirk had been speaking. Within seconds, chaos erupted throughout the venue as panic spread like wildfire. Charlie collapsed on the stage, his hand clutching his chest as crimson spread across his shirt. The crowd scattered in terror, the sound of running feet echoing in the arena as people fled for safety. The shooter slipped away into the gathering darkness, leaving behind devastation and unanswered questions that would haunt a nation. News alerts flashed across phones within minutes, delivering the unthinkable headline to millions of Americans. Charlie Kirk, shot at Utah Valley University, read the notification that would stop hearts nationwide. Across America, living rooms filled with stunned silence and disbelief as the news spread. Tears streamed down faces as people realized what had just happened to the young conservative leader. Social media exploded with expressions of sorrow and anger at the senseless violence. In Washington, Donald Trump Jr. was pulled aside from a meeting in the West Wing by a solemn-faced aide. He froze as he read the incoming message on his phone, unable to process the words before him. His hands trembled visibly as the reality sank, and his closest friend, more like a brother than a colleague, had been taken by an act of pure evil. In that moment, Don Jr.'s world cracked open before him, and America braced for what would become the most painful prayer it would ever witness. Sirens wailed across Utah as federal agents swarmed the university campus in force. The shooter had vanished, but the hunt was only beginning as law enforcement mobilized at unprecedented speed. Helicopters hovered overhead, powerful searchlights sweeping across rooftops and parking structures. Students wept in the parking lot, some clutching each other for support, others frantically calling parents to assure them of their safety. Charlie's voice, the one that had once calmed, challenged, and inspired millions, was now silenced forever. President Donald Trump, visibly shaken and furious, addressed the nation from the Oval Office within hours of the shooting. This cowardly attack on Charlie Kirk was not just an attack on a man, the president declared solemnly. It was an attack on America's soul, on our fundamental freedoms, on our very way of life. We will find the perpetrator of this heinous act, he promised the nation. Justice will be swift and justice will be unforgiving for this attack on our democracy. But even as the president's words rang across the airwaves, it was Donald Trump Jr. whom Americans waited anxiously to hear from. Everyone knew how incredibly close he and Charlie had been throughout the years of building the conservative movement. Everyone waited for Trump Jr.'s voice, his prayer, his tribute to the friend who had stood beside him through countless battles. Don Jr. sat alone in his office, head bowed low under the weight of grief too heavy to bear. Reporters gathered outside, waiting respectfully for any statement from the man who had lost his dearest friend. His staff whispered that the cameras were ready whenever he felt able to speak. But Don Jr. wasn't thinking about cameras or public statements in that moment of raw grief. He was thinking about the last hug Charlie had given him just 3 days earlier at a campaign event in Michigan. He was remembering the last time Charlie had said, "I'm praying for you, brother," before boarding his flight to Utah. Now, it was Don Jr. who needed to pray for his fallen friend before a watching nation. The White House press briefing room was eerily silent as journalists awaited his arrival. It wasn't the usual restless silence filled with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. This was a heavy silence like the air before a devastating storm breaks over vulnerable land. Donald Trump Jr. walked in slowly, his face pale and drawn, his eyes visibly red from tears he had shed in private. The cameras clicked softly, but no reporter spoke a single question as he approached the podium. Even the journalists, so often sharp and combative in their questioning, were subdued by the palpable grief filling the room. He placed his hands on the podium, gripping it tightly as though steadying himself against a powerful wave of emotion. He paused, gathering whatever strength remained within him for the words that must be spoken. For a long moment, he couldn't speak at all, the silence stretching out as America held its collective breath. Then, with a trembling voice that betrayed his shattered heart, he began the address that would unite a divided nation in grief. "The brutal murder of Charlie Kirk is nothing short of evil incarnate," he began, his voice breaking on the words. "A cowardly attack on America's very soul has taken from us one of our brightest lights." His voice cracked with emotion, but he pressed on, his words heavy with the grief of personal loss. Charlie was a Christian who had accepted Jesus as his Savior and lived that faith every day of his life. Tonight we know the Lord is greeting him, saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." Some in the press room wept openly at the raw emotion in Trump Jr.'s voice. Others bowed their heads in respect for the fallen conservative leader. Across the country, millions of Americans watched as Donald Trump Jr. struggled through his tears to honor his friend. And in that moment, it felt as if the entire nation had gathered for a prayer that would echo through history forever. Phones across the nation buzzed nonstop as people shared the live broadcast with loved ones. Every television channel cut to live coverage of the extraordinary moment unfolding in Washington. News anchors spoke with trembling voices, trying to contextualize what had happened in Utah while respecting the gravity of the moment. Students who had been inside the hall gave emotional interviews through tears, their voices shaking as they described the chaos that had erupted. "He was just talking about faith and freedom." One young woman whispered, her mascara streaked down her face from crying. "And then the shot rang out so suddenly. I still hear it in my head when I close my eyes." America felt paralyzed by the shocking assassination of such a prominent young leader. Churches opened their doors for impromptu prayer services across the country. Families sat quietly around dinner tables, struggling to find words adequate for the moment. People who had never met Charlie Kirk personally found themselves weeping, feeling as if they had lost a member of their own family. Meanwhile, Donald Trump Jr. prepared himself to continue speaking, drawing on inner reserves of strength. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages of condolence from supporters, fellow politicians, and ordinary Americans reaching out. But he didn't look at the screen, couldn't bear to see the flood of grief pouring in from across the nation. Instead, he sat in silence during a brief pause, staring at a single photo of him and Charlie laughing together backstage at a Turning Point USA event just weeks earlier. The weight on his shoulders grew heavier with each passing moment as the nation looked to him for comfort. Soon, he would have to lift America with words that could barely escape his own broken heart. As Don Jr. composed himself at the podium, his mind drifted back to the first time Charlie had reached out to him years earlier. It was 2015, during the early days of his father's presidential campaign, when most established Republicans had kept their distance. He remembered how a simple Twitter message from the young activists, just a few words of encouragement during a difficult news cycle, had marked the beginning of their brotherhood. Charlie wasn't just a political ally to Don Jr. throughout the years that followed. He was a mentor in connecting with young conservatives, a listener during personal struggles, and at times even a spiritual guide. When Don Jr. faced his toughest public criticism, Charlie had been the first person to call and pray with him over the phone. He had believed in the Trump family's mission long before it was politically expedient to do so. Now that loyal voice of encouragement was gone forever, silenced by a bullet fired in hatred. "How do I do this without you, brother?" Don Jr. whispered quietly to himself at the podium. His staff looked on, unsure of what to say to comfort him in this darkest of moments. They had never seen the normally confident Trump's son so vulnerable, so utterly human in his grief. Across social media, Americans began posting their own memories and encounters with the fallen conservative leader. Old photos from Turning Point USA events filled timelines as people shared how Kirk had touched their lives. Young people shared how Charlie had inspired them to stand tall in hostile college classrooms to defend their beliefs without fear of ridicule. Grief was everywhere, flowing across political boundaries that had seemed impenetrable just hours earlier. Yet, alongside the grief, something unexpected was emerging. Unity in a nation long divided by bitter partisanship. For the first time in years, America wasn't split down the middle by political hatred and scorn. It was joined together in tears for a young life cut tragically short before its full potential could be realized. The briefing room phone rang unexpectedly, breaking the solemn silence. Don Jr. answered with a hoarse, "Hello," his voice rough from emotion. On the other end was President Trump, his father, calling from the Oval Office. His voice was heavy, slower than usual, weighed down with shared grief for the young man they had both admired. "Don," the president said softly, uncharacteristically gentle. "I know he was like a brother to you all these years." Don Jr. closed his eyes tightly, fighting back a fresh wave of tears at his father's words. "Yes, sir," he managed to respond. "He was the brother I chose, the one who stood with us when others wouldn't." There was a poignant pause on the line between father and son, united in grief. Then President Trump continued, his voice carrying both sorrow and resolve. "Charlie really loved his family so much. He was so proud of Erica and their children. I saw it every time he visited the White House. This loss is beyond words, beyond politics. But we cannot let it be in vain, son. You and we must carry his fight forward for the country he loved so deeply." Don Jr. nodded silently, gripping the phone tighter as he absorbed his father's words. The president's challenge echoed in his chest, cutting through the fog of grief with purpose. Minutes later, the White House press team announced that Donald Trump Jr. would lead the nation in prayer for Charlie Kirk. Later that evening, millions were already tuning in across America, waiting, grieving, hoping for words that might help bind the country's wounds. As Don Jr. prepared to address the nation again, he whispered under his breath, "Charlie, help me find the words. I need your strength tonight, brother." The stage was set for a moment that would transcend ordinary politics in extraordinary ways. The nation held its collective breath for the prayer about to be offered by a man known more for political fights than public vulnerability. By evening, every news network had turned its cameras toward Washington in anticipation. From New York to Los Angeles, from small-town diners to college dormitories, people were glued to their screens and shared national grief. Even busy airports had fallen unusually quiet as travelers stopped to watch the broadcast on terminal televisions. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram were flooded. That had seen too much deception. They had felt systematically mocked for years by influential elites like Rosie without any recourse. And now justice finally seemed within reach for ordinary Americans everywhere. In countless living rooms from Florida to Montana, viewers whispered the same heartfelt words to each other. "This man genuinely loves this country with his whole heart." Rosie shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her once commanding voice now noticeably softer and uncertain. "This entire situation isn't remotely fair or balanced," she complained weakly. But deep in her heart, she recognized that Trump had arrived meticulously prepared for this confrontation. Rosie's increasingly frantic team huddled closely around her during a hastily arranged short commercial break. "Rosie, you absolutely must fight back aggressively. Claim he's deliberately lying about everything. Call him an authoritarian dictator. Say absolutely anything to regain control of this narrative." She nodded weakly as the cameras prepared to return from the commercial break. "Mr. President," Rosie said with a forced, unconvincing grin as broadcasting resumed. "You're clearly intimidated by strong, independent women like me. You always have been throughout your entire career. That's precisely why you're inventing these completely ridiculous accusations without any evidence." Trump chuckled softly in response. It wasn't remotely the nervous laugh of someone feeling pressured or cornered. It was the calm, confident response of someone who knew they held all the factual evidence. "Intimidated by you, Rosie," he replied with measured composure. "I'm not remotely intimidated by you personally. I'm deeply concerned for the American people who have been systematically deceived for years while you secretly enriched yourself at their expense." Social media platforms absolutely exploded with real-time reactions from viewers. Millions instantly posted crying emojis alongside brief clips of Trump's powerful speech that resonated with their experiences. "I never particularly cared about politics before tonight," one young mother tweeted passionately. "But seeing Trump courageously fighting for ordinary Americans like this has me literally sobbing with emotion. He's truly a genuine hero, standing against corruption." Rosa's voice noticeably cracked as she desperately tried to regain some measure of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. "You'll deeply regret this confrontation, Donald. I'll systematically dismantle your reputation completely." But in her heart, she already recognized she was fighting a losing battle against the truth. As Trump methodically continued his response, his voice grew perceptibly warmer and more emotionally resonant with viewers. "I didn't seek this high office to cultivate friendships with media personalities or Hollywood celebrities. I came here with a singular mission to comprehensively drain the corrupt swamp and protect hardworking Americans who've been forgotten. Viewers across the nation were openly crying now without embarrassment. Truck drivers spontaneously parked along highways to watch the historic broadcast on their phones. Military service members stationed overseas wiped emotional tears from their eyes while huddled around screens in their barracks. This precisely explains why they systematically hate me, Trump said with genuine emotion in his voice. Because as I steadfastly refuse to allow corruption to continue unchallenged, even if that means standing completely alone against powerful interests. In the increasingly silent studio, Rosa's eyes glistened noticeably with barely contained tears. Her trademark smug expression had completely vanished without a trace. The once loudly outspoken comedian now resembled a child caught in an elaborate deception of her own making. "Rosie," Trump concluded with unmistakable finality in his tone, "you arrogantly proclaimed yourself to be my worst nightmare. But the uncomfortable reality is that tonight the genuine nightmare belongs entirely to you. America is finally fully awake to the deception." The broadcast immediately cut to powerful images of ordinary Americans spontaneously waving flags outside their modest homes. They were chanting in unison with genuine passion, "We love Trump. We love Trump," without any prompting. And in that pivotal moment, Rosie painfully realized she had catastrophically underestimated the authentic heart of the American people. The studio lights flickered momentarily as Trump's commanding voice unexpectedly returned. His tone remained perfectly calm, but deadly serious in its delivery. "Rosie, I genuinely wasn't planning to address this particular issue tonight, but since you persistently mock me as intellectually challenged, let's discuss actual intelligence." Rosie desperately attempted to interrupt, but Trump continued with unwavering resolve that captivated viewers. "I currently possess conclusive contracts and internal memoranda clearly demonstrating how you systematically misused your platform to spread deliberately biased narratives, all while simultaneously laundering substantial funds through fake charitable foundations that help nobody except yourself. Rosie, you repeatedly claimed to boldly stand for truth and transparency, but you comprehensively betrayed the very people you solemnly swore to entertain and inform." The studio audience collectively gasped in stunned disbelief at these revelations. Rosa's face turned ashen gray as the implications fully registered. "Let me be absolutely clear about your situation," Trump added with measured precision. "You're not currently under arrest for these activities, but you are definitely under active federal investigation for conspiracy against the American people. And if these serious charges are ultimately proven in court, you may soon find yourself permanently returning to Ireland as your primary residence." The nation erupted in emotional responses to these revelations. Viewers at home broke into tears, some from profound relief, others from justified anger at being deceived for so long. One elderly veteran whispered through heartfelt sobs, "Finally, someone courageously standing up for ordinary Americans like us." Rosie visibly swallowed hard, struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. For the first time in her entire media career, she genuinely didn't know how to effectively counter the truth with her usual tactics. During an emergency commercial break, Rosa's increasingly desperate team urgently advised her, "You absolutely must regain narrative control immediately. Claim he's deliberately lying about everything. Label him an authoritarian dictator. Say absolutely anything to flip this narrative in your favor." When the cameras resumed broadcasting, Rosie attempted to fake her formerly confident, combative demeanor. "Mr. President, you're clearly fabricating elaborate stories because you're fundamentally afraid of strong women like me. Just admit the truth. You deeply resent powerful women who challenge your authority." Trump smiled knowingly, shaking his head with quiet confidence that resonated with viewers. "Rosie, this confrontation isn't remotely about strong women or gender politics. It's exclusively about honest Americans versus corrupt individuals who abuse their positions. I genuinely respect authentic." Boisberg never returned to his post. Technically, he was still a federal judge, but he stayed behind the scenes consulting, writing papers, speaking quietly at universities under Chatham House rules. His name had become a case study, no longer a man. One rainy afternoon, he sat in a small conference room at an American university, talking to a group of second-year law students. They expected bitterness, maybe some subtle jabs at Bondi or the administration, but what they got was a reflection. "I didn't break the law," he said, "but I forgot the people outside the law, the ones watching. That was my mistake. A student raised her hand. Would you do it differently? Bosberg gave a small laugh. I'd do it slower, not softer, just with more care. Pam Bondi, meanwhile, had become a household name. Again, not for scandal, not for a book deal, but for reshaping the conversation around judges and public trust. She toured the country that fall, speaking at law enforcement summits, legal policy forums, and even a few universities where protesters lined the sidewalks. At one such event in Austin, Texas, a young man asked her directly, "Do you think you damaged the judiciary?" She answered without blinking, "No. I think I reminded them who they serve." He didn't argue. He just sat back thinking that was Bondi's real talent, not forcing agreement, but forcing the question to stick. In a quiet suburb outside Cincinnati, an elderly woman named Carol Jenkins sat in her kitchen watching an old recording of Bondi's Fox News interview, the one that had started it all. She'd followed every part of the saga, not because she was into politics, but because she'd once lost a case in family court that left her wondering if judges ever heard regular people. She paused the clip and whispered. Finally, someone said it. Her daughter across the table didn't reply. She didn't agree with Bondi, but she couldn't deny one thing. More people were talking about justice than ever before, and that mattered. Chief Justice Roberts stayed in the background after his ABA speech. No new statements, no interviews, but his actions spoke. He approved a sweeping review of internal judicial training on ethics, transparency, and community engagement. It didn't make headlines, but it changed things. Judges started hosting town halls, once a rare practice. They started writing columns explaining how decisions were made, not to justify, but to clarify. In Phoenix, a federal judge opened her courtroom once a month to the public, not for trials, but for questions, real questions from people who didn't know how the system worked, and she answered without hiding behind legal ease. One attendee said afterward, "I didn't agree with her, but I understood her, and that was new." In the end, Bondi didn't push for Bosberg's impeachment. She didn't need to. The point had been made loud, sharp, permanent. Her critics called her dangerous. Her supporters called her courageous, but she called herself something else, accountable. And maybe that was the lesson. Maybe the story wasn't about heroes or villains, but about discomfort, about asking hard questions out loud, even if the answers weren't clean. Months later, Bondi and Roberts found themselves in the same room. It wasn't planned. A national judicial symposium in Baltimore, both invited on separate panels. They passed each other in a hallway during a break. Bondi offered a nod. Roberts hesitated, then returned it. That was it. Not a truce, not forgiveness. Just two people who had stood on opposite sides of something larger than themselves. The story of Pam Bondi, Judge Bosberg, and John Roberts wasn't about taking someone down. It was about what happens when public trust wavers, and what institutions must do when silence is no longer enough. So, here's the question. Who watches the watchers when the watchers stop watching themselves? Think about that, because one day it might not be a judge under the spotlight. It might be someone who looks a lot like you. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to the channel. We've got more real-world stories that ask the hard questions and refuse the easy answers.